Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Sudan, a regional governor from Darfur was assassinated Wednesday after he publicly blamed the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces and allied Arab militias for the genocide of civilians. West Darfur State Governor Hamis Abachar was abducted and killed hours after making the remarks in a TV interview. Reuters reports two government sources said the RSF was responsible for the killing. On Wednesday, the International Organization for Migration said fighting between rival military factions in Sudan has now displaced more than 2 million people from their homes, with more than 500,000 fleeing to neighboring countries. Nearly 1,000 civilians have been killed, according to a local monitoring group. In Ukraine, the mayor of Kryvyi Rih says Russian missiles struck 2 civilian industrial sites overnight, injuring at least 1 person. The attack came days after another attack on the central Ukrainian city killed 11 civilians. Elsewhere, Ukraine's military said it shot down 18 Russian drones over the Black Sea port city of Odessa overnight. And Russia's TASS news agency reports Ukrainian artillery fire killed a child in a Russian-occupied part of Kherson region. On Tuesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with pro-war bloggers at the Kremlin, where he said Russia's military operations in Ukraine have been plagued by shortages of precision-guided munitions, communications gear, aircraft and drones, as well as other equipment, in a rare admission. The leader of Belarus said Tuesday he's received nuclear weapons from Russia and won't hesitate to use them if his nation's security is at stake. President Alexander Lukashenko made the remarks in an interview with a Russian state TV channel Tuesday evening.
We have missiles and bombs that we have received from Russia, both that are 3 times more powerful than the ones used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There, more than 80,000 people died instantly, 250,000 overall. That's from 1 strike. And this one is 3 times more powerful. I don't know, up to 1 million people would die immediately if, God forbid, this weapon were used.
Exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tishakanskaya called on the world leaders to respond to Russia's first deployment of tactical nuclear weapons outside its borders since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. She wrote on social media, quote, "It creates a serious threat to regional security and sets us on a dangerous path for nuclear escalation. The world must show Lukashenko and Putin that it won't give in to nuclear blackmail." Thousands of protesters took to the streets of cities across Poland Wednesday after a pregnant woman died when medical workers refused to provide her with a life-saving abortion. 33-year-old Dorota Lalik died of sepsis in May, 3 days after her water broke, and she was admitted to the John Paul II Hospital. The hospital has deep ties to the Catholic Church, and medical staff there opted out of providing abortion care, citing a so-called conscience clause allowed under Polish law. This is a protester at Wednesday's pro-choice march in Warsaw.
I came here because I do not agree with women dying, that they have no choice, that doctors have a so-called conscience clause. If they want conscience clauses, they would change their profession. Women are dying because of them, and also because of the law that has been established in Poland.
Here in the United States, the Justice Department has charged an active-duty Marine and 1 other person for firebombing a Planned Parenthood clinic in Costa Mesa, California, with a Molotov cocktail in March of last year. The 2 arrested men, Chance Brannon and Tibet Irgul, could face up to 20 years in federal prison. In related news, a new report from the Center for Countering Digital Hate finds Google made over $10 million from ads by anti-abortion groups. The Google ads were for so-called crisis pregnancy centers, which aim to steer people away from having abortions while posing as reproductive health care clinics. The Southern Baptist Convention has voted to uphold the expulsion of 2 churches led by women pastors, tightening the church's restrictions on women, banning them not just from serving as pastors, but from having any kind of leadership position. The moves come after organizing by the Southern Baptist Church's ultra-conservative members. In climate news, officials in India and Pakistan have ordered the evacuation of more than 150,000 people as Cyclone Biparjoy makes landfall in India's Gujarat state. The storm crashed ashore earlier today near high tide with a storm surge that threatened to inundate low-lying coastal areas. It's just the third cyclone to hit India's west coast in nearly 6 decades. Here in the United States, thick smoke from dozens of wildfires burning in Canada settled over Wisconsin and Minnesota Wednesday, triggering air quality alerts for very unhealthy levels of fine particle and ozone pollution. The air quality index topped 240 in the Twin Cities, the region's worst levels on record. President Biden's vetoed legislation that would have rolled back a new rule limiting emissions from heavy-duty vehicles. The White House says the rule change will cut nitrogen oxide emissions in half by 2045, preventing thousands of childhood asthma cases and premature deaths every year. The bill to repeal the tougher emissions cleared the Senate in April with the support of Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia and with ailing California Senator Dianne Feinstein absent. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives has failed in its effort to override President Biden's veto of legislation that would have blocked police accountability legislation passed by the Washington, D.C. City Council in the wake of George Floyd's murder. 13 Democrats joined with House Republicans in voting to overrule the D.C. law, which expands access to police disciplinary records and body camera footage, limits the use of tear gas and other chemical agents, and bans certain police tactics, including chokeholds. Washington, D.C.'s non-voting delegate to Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton, said in a statement, quote, "The disapproval resolution is a profoundly undemocratic and paternalistic piece of legislation. Almost 700,000 people live in the nation's capital, and they're worthy and capable of governing their own local affairs," unquote. Here in New York, a grand jury's indicted former U.S. Marine Daniel Penny over the killing of Jordan Neely on a city subway on May 1st. Penny, who's white, held Jordan Neely in a chokehold until he died. Neely, a beloved street performer, was unhoused and hungry, crying out for help when the ex-Marine attacked him. The charges will be unsealed when Penny's arraigned. The date of his arraignment is expected to be announced today. The Federal Reserve has decided to hold interest rates steady after 10 consecutive increases since early 2022. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren welcomed Wednesday's announcement by Fed Chair Jerome Powell, writing, quote, "The Fed raised interest rates at the fastest pace in decades, and it needs to maintain this pause or risk throwing millions of Americans out of work," unquote. The European Union's advanced a major new law that would regulate artificial intelligence as governments around the world grapple with how to respond to the possible threats of the fast-moving technology. The EU draft law includes restrictions on the use of facial recognition and mandates disclosures of data by makers of chatbots and deepfake videos. This is European Parliament President Roberta Metsola.
Going forward, we are going to need constant, clear boundaries and limits to artificial intelligence. And here there is one thing that we will not compromise on. Anytime technology advances, it must go hand in hand with our fundamental rights and democratic values.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said he supports the idea of global watchdog for artificial intelligence that could play a role in similar to how the International Agency of Atomic Energy regulates nuclear technology.
The scientists and experts have called on the world to act, declaring AI an existential threat to humanity on a par with the risk of nuclear war.
Here in the United States, Jennifer DeStefano, an Arizona mother, testified at a Senate hearing this week about her harrowing experience with a deep fake scam that tricked her into thinking her daughter had been kidnapped. DeStefano says the fake kidnappers demanded a $50,000 ransom before she got in touch with her daughter, who was in fact safe and sound.
It was my daughter's voice. It was her cries. It was her sobs. It was the way she spoke. I will never be able to shake that voice and the desperate cries for help out of my mind. It's every parent's worst nightmare to hear your child pleading with fear and pain, knowing that they are being harmed and that you're helpless. The longer this form of terror remains unpunishable, the farther and more egregious it will become. There is no limit to the depth of evil AI can enable.
Meanwhile, election integrity groups have been sounding the alarm over the use of AI to misinform people ahead of the 2024 U.S. election. Florida's Republican governor, presidential hopeful Ron DeSantis, released an attack ad earlier this month showing AI-generated deepfake images of Donald Trump hugging and kissing Anthony Fauci. And a Guatemalan court Wednesday convicted prominent journalist Jose Ruben Zamora of money laundering and sentenced him to 6 years in prison, what rights groups have condemned as a trumped-up case and part of a crackdown on press freedom by the right-wing government of President Alejandro Giammattei. Zamora is the founder and president of the investigative newspaper El Periódico and has long reported on Guatemalan government corruption. The newspaper was forced to shut down in May after months of intensifying harassment and persecution. To see our interview with Jose Ruben Zamora's son, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.